spirituality.
So Wilbur's point within that is not that science and spirituality won't come together, because science and spirituality are not incompatible to begin with, but they require they're different truth claims that require different modes of observation and understanding. And spirituality as an inner experience is an upper left phenomenon, right, in the mind, consciousness, awareness dimension. And you can't assess that in the same objective, empirical way that you can objectify matter and energy, which is what most science prioritizes. And so the scientific method will encompass spirituality, but reductionistic, materialistic science that's empirically trying to measure objects that are physical and tangible require different types of instrumentation. So if you're measuring upper right phenomenon, which most science, in fact, one of the reasons we have to be really careful, one of the payoffs here that was trying to be stated is that spirituality does not reduce to quantum physics. It's really important to get that, because that is a horrible misunderstanding that's in the New Age communities right now. In fact, spirituality doesn't need physics at all. That's the point. And physics doesn't really need spirituality either. They're two separate strands. Physics deals with matter, energy, upper right phenomenon. Spirituality deals with upper left consciousness phenomenon. Upper left phenomenology does not occupy location or have mass. Therefore, it can't be measured with the instrumentation that physicists use or materialistic sciences use to measure objective stuff. So one of the problems that's happened in academia is a reductionism. It actually started with the Western Enlightenment, when we came into this modernist rational critique, is all of this stuff that we couldn't really measure, i.e. our mind, our subjective experience, our spirituality, started to become simply not true, because it could not be objectified through third-party empirical investigation using the instruments that measure matter, energy, things that have location or substance. And so the point here, and Wilbur critiqued this in a book called, in fact, The Marriage of Sense and Soul, right? So they are compatible, but they require separate modes of investigation. And so you can, for instance, and there are actually 3 different modes of investigation. There's a science of matter right? And there's a science of mind, and there's a science of spirit. For instance, one of the problems with materialistic reductionism of trying to reduce everything to objective stuff is it leaves out the upper left and lower left categories, these profound human dimensions. I mean, what could be more important than your own mind and your own consciousness and your own subjectivity, right? And so when we try to say, well, because we can't measure that with our microscopes, with our telescopes, with our rulers, with our EEG machines, with our MRIs, with our, whatever we're using, since we can't use that, it's not really real. And that's been disastrous, and that's produced the whole atheist movement of modernity, right? And so we can measure things that have matter and energy through objective, empirical measurement, through technologies that will do that. But we can't measure, for instance, mathematics in the same way. That requires a science of the mind. Now the interesting thing is that mathematics has no location. This formula doesn't really exist in any objective space. It's a symbol, the formula is a symbol, but what it points to does not occupy a simple location, what it represents. And so it takes a science of the mind, not a science of matter. It takes a science of the mind to understand mathematics. And then we have a science of contemplation to really understand spirit. And these can be rigorously scientific if we open up our definition of science, which it was never meant to include. There's nothing in the definition of science that's meant to reduce it to empirical measurement of matter energy, right? It's perform an injunction. Perform an injunction, generate data, submit that data comparatively to a community of the adequate, right? And then make truth claims based on it. That's what science does, even if we're measuring a drug. That can also be applied to measuring the transcendent awakening. You perform an injunction, right? You don't take a microscope out and look at a molecule. This injunction, you engage the subtle energy vortexes. You awaken higher capacities of your brain. You introduce the meditation. That's the injunction you performed, and then you generate data. I am having an awakening experience, which can mean almost nothing scientifically when the N is 1. But when we compare that to a community of the adequate, we start getting peer review. We start getting patterns that coalesce and that have a high degree of rigor and reproducibility. And so the wisdom traditions, and this is why the spiritual but not religious, that's why I'm really pushing in right now to postmodern spirituality and the spiritual but not religion movement, because it is so ridiculously superficial. You take traditions like, and not Americanized versions of these, but traditions like Zen or Tibetan Dzogchen or Vajrayana, and these, for instance, meditative states that have been articulated have been submitted to more investigation than most anything has in Western reductionistic science. And so you can take a Zen master, right? And if a student first of all practices the injunction properly, crosses their legs, lowers their eyes effectively, looks at the flickering candle flame, is unflinching for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, and then at some point reports, I think I had a satori. Now you can't know that for sure because it's interior phenomenology. It's not, you can't pull that out somewhere and put it under a microscope, right? And so what do? Well, you first of all look. You then start comparing. You start then bringing in the community of the adequate, and Zen masters and Zen texts and Zen traditions have been looking at this for centuries, and they can ask the students some questions. All right. Tell me about that. Well, I felt this beam of light. No, that's not a satori. Go cross your legs, close your eyes, open them halfway, put your tongue on the roof of your mouth and cancel and come back and see me in a month, right? And so they can pull out that interior phenomenology and develop a certain critique of it that there's consensus on. And the traditions have patterned out these, stages of meditative awakening, contemplative awakening. And the great thing, and they line up very closely with source code meditation's enlightenment states.